A father adopts a black baby despite everyone warning him against doing so. Years later, he gets a surprise that changes his life, leaving him in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden stripes across George Wilkins' kitchen table as he sat there, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. The tick-tock of the old wall clock echoed through the empty house, each second a reminder of his solitude. He glanced at the framed photo of Susan on the counter. Her warm smile still brightened the room, even if only from behind glass now. 2 years, he whispered, his voice scratchy from disuse. The house felt too big these days. His daughter Emily lived in Seattle with her husband, and his son Mark had settled in Boston. Their weekly phone calls, while cherished, couldn't fill the quiet spaces of his daily life. George switched on the small TV on the kitchen counter, more for background noise than interest. But as he reached to adjust the volume, a news segment caught his attention. A reporter stood outside a local foster care center, speaking about children waiting for permanent homes. "These kids just want someone to love them," the reporter said, her voice gentle but urgent. "The need for adoptive parents has never been greater." George's hand froze on the remote. The coffee mug trembled slightly in his other hand, as memories of his teaching days flooded back. The joy of helping young minds grow. The satisfaction of making a difference in children's lives. The next afternoon, his fingers hesitated over his phone before dialing the number he'd written down from the news report. A warm voice answered, introducing herself as Maggie from the adoption agency. George paused, gathering his courage. "I'd like to learn more about adopting a child." Maggie's kindness made the conversation easier. She explained the process, the requirements, the home studies. When she mentioned they had several infants needing homes, including a baby boy named Elijah, George felt something stir in his heart. "He's been with us since birth," Maggie explained. "He's black, and we're looking for a family who understands the unique challenges and responsibilities of transracial adoption." George thought back to his years teaching during desegregation, the lessons he'd learned about justice and equality. His voice grew stronger as he replied, "I'd like to learn more about Elijah." The sound of Elijah's laughter echoed through the hallway, replacing the silence that had once filled George's home. Tiny handprints decorated the windows, and colorful toys dotted the living room floor. George watched his son play with a set of wooden blocks, his heart swelling with love. The nursery, once his old office, now sparkled with soft blues and gentle yellows. A mobile of stars and moons danced above the crib, casting dancing shadows on the walls. George had spent weeks getting everything perfect, reading parenting books late into the night, and learning the intricate art of diaper changing. "Da-da!" Elijah called out, reaching for George with chubby hands. The simple word never failed to make George's eyes mist over. Time seemed to fly by. Soon, Elijah was taking his first wobbly steps across the living room carpet, George hovering nearby with outstretched arms. His first clear words followed, then full sentences, each milestone celebrated with proud phone calls to Emily and Mark. But the parent-teacher meeting with Mrs. Blake changed everything. She sat across from George in her small classroom, her expression gentle but concerned. "Mr. Wilkins, there's something we need to discuss," she began, folding her hands on the tiny desk. As she explained the teasing, each word felt like a physical blow. George's throat tightened as he learned how other children had called his precious boy dark and strange. His mind flashed to Elijah's recent quiet moods after school, the way he'd stopped talking about his classmates. That evening, George sat heavily on his living room couch. The family photos on the wall seemed to watch him, pictures of Elijah's first birthday, their trip to the park, moments of pure joy captured in time. But now, a shadow had fallen over these happy memories. His son was hurting, and he hadn't even known. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. How could he protect Elijah from something so deeply ingrained in society? His own experiences during the civil rights movement hadn't prepared him for this, for seeing his 4-year-old son face such cruelty. The next morning, George sat at his kitchen table, phone in hand, his fingers hovering over Maggie's number. His coffee grew cold as he gathered his courage. Finally, he dialed. "Maggie, it's George Wilkins. I need your help." Her warm voice came through clearly. "What's going on, George?" As he explained the situation at preschool, Maggie listened patiently. "There's a cultural camp for children of color," she suggested. "It might help Elijah connect with his heritage and meet other kids like him." That evening, George sat at his computer, surrounded by books about racial identity and parenting across cultures. His eyes burned from reading articles late into the night, but he kept going. He needed to understand, to be better for Elijah. A week later, they pulled into the camp's parking lot. Bright banners welcomed them, and children's laughter filled the air. George's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he noticed he was the only white parent there. "Ready, buddy?" he asked Elijah, who nodded excitedly. As they walked toward the registration table, George felt eyes on him. A father approached them, introducing himself as Jamal. His friendly smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "So," Jamal said, his voice measured, "what made you decide to adopt a black child?" Before George could answer, Jamal continued, "Why would you adopt a black child if you don't understand our struggles?" George's mouth went dry. I wanted to give a child a loving home," he stammered. Elijah tugged at his hand. "Daddy, why doesn't that man like you?" Back home that evening, George sat with Elijah on their favorite spot on the couch. His son's small face was pinched with worry. "Daddy, do they not like me because I'm black?" George's heart broke. He pulled Elijah close. "No, buddy. Some people might not understand our family, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that I love you, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what." George sat at his breakfast table the next morning, stirring his coffee absently. Elijah's words from yesterday echoed in his mind. "Do they not like me because I'm black?" He had to do better for his son. In the local newspaper, a notice caught his eye. "Town hall meeting, building a better community through understanding." George circled the date with his red pen. That evening, after tucking Elijah in with his favorite teddy bear, George drove to the community center. The parking lot was packed. Inside, the room hummed with voices and energy. George found a seat near the back, notebook in hand. Speaker after speaker shared their experiences. Then Angela Simmons took the podium. She stood tall, her voice clear and passionate, as she spoke about raising black children in predominantly white areas. "Our children need to see themselves reflected in their community," she said. "They need mentors who understand their experiences, who can guide them through the unique challenges they face." George wrote frantically, hanging onto every word. After the meeting ended, he gathered his courage and approached Angela. "Ms. Simmons?" His voice wavered slightly. "I'm George Wilkins. I adopted my son Elijah. He's black, and I'm trying to learn how to be a better father to him." Angela's expression softened. "That takes courage to admit, Mr. Wilkins. Tell me about Elijah." They talked for 20 minutes. George shared his concerns, his fears, the incident at the cultural camp. Angela listened thoughtfully. "I'd be happy to meet with you again," she offered. There's a network of families here who could help support both you and Elijah. Would you be interested in that?" Later that night, George sat at his kitchen table, writing down everything he'd learned. His earlier uncertainty was replaced with something new: hope. He might not have all the answers, but he wasn't alone anymore. George noticed the change in Elijah gradually, like watching clouds darken before a storm. His usually chatty son had grown quiet during car rides home from school. The bright smile that once lit up rooms now appeared less often. One evening, Elijah trudged through the front door, his backpack dragging behind him. His shoulders slumped forward, and his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "Hey, buddy," George said softly. "Everything okay at school today?" "I'm fine, Dad." Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. He headed straight to his room, leaving George standing in the hallway, his heart heavy with worry. At the parent-teacher conference the following week, Mrs. Blake's concerned expression made George's stomach twist before she even spoke. "Mr. Wilkins," she began, adjusting her reading glasses, "I'm worried about Elijah. He used to be our most enthusiastic student, always the first to raise his hand, always eager to share during show and tell. But lately," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "he's become withdrawn. When the other children play at recess, he sits alone with his books. He barely participates in class discussions anymore." George's throat tightened. "Has anyone been cruel to him?" "No, nothing like that," Mrs. Blake assured him. "It's more like he's pulling away on his own." That evening, George sat in his favorite armchair, the one Susan used to curl up in with her mystery novels. The house felt especially quiet. His mind raced with doubts he'd tried to push away for months. Maybe Elijah needed someone who truly understood what it meant to grow up black in America. Someone who could guide him through experiences George could only read about in books. Someone who could look at Elijah and see their own reflection. The weight of inadequacy pressed down on his shoulders as he watched the shadows lengthen across the living room floor. He loved his son more than anything in this world. But was love enough? George stepped into the community center, his heart pounding. The room was filled with the gentle hum of conversation, and Angela's warm smile immediately put him at ease. "Welcome, George," she said, gesturing to an empty chair in the circle. "We're glad you could join us." As George settled in, parents began sharing their stories. A mother spoke about her daughter's struggle to embrace her natural hair in a school where she was the only black student. Another parent described helping his son cope with microaggressions from well-meaning but ignorant neighbors. "It's like walking a tightrope sometimes," one father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You want them to be proud of who they are, but you also need to prepare them for a world that isn't always kind." George listened intently, recognizing pieces of Elijah's struggles in each story. After the meeting, Angela pulled up a chair beside him. "Tell me about Elijah," she said softly. "How's he doing?" George described Elijah's withdrawal, his quiet demeanor, the way he seemed to be shrinking into himself. Angela nodded understanding. "Children need mirrors, George," she explained. "They need to see themselves reflected in the people around them. Elijah needs black role models, mentors who can show him it's okay to be exactly who he is." "But how do I find these mentors?" George asked, his voice uncertain. "They're here in our community," Angela assured him. "Teachers, professionals, artists, people who would love to connect with Elijah. But remember, this isn't about fixing something that's broken. It's about adding more love, more support, more understanding to Elijah's life." On the drive home, George's mind was full. The stories from the support group echoed in his thoughts, along with Angela's words about mirrors and mentors. He felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter knowing he wasn't alone in this journey. Heavier understanding the depth of what Elijah needed. As he pulled into his driveway, George realized that being Elijah's father meant more than just providing a loving home. It meant building a bridge between Elijah and a community that could help him understand and embrace his identity. George sat nervously in the community center's lobby, watching as Marcus Thompson approached them with a warm smile. The man's presence was calming, his dark eyes kind and understanding. "You must be Elijah," Marcus said, kneeling to meet Elijah's eye level. "I'm Marcus. I hear you like drawing?" Elijah nodded shyly, but his eyes sparkled with interest. George watched in amazement as Marcus gently drew his son into conversation, asking about his favorite subjects at school and what he liked to do for fun. "I like art class," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger. "But sometimes the other kids don't want to sit with me." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I felt the same way when I was your age. Would you like to see where I work? We have lots of kids here who love art too." Over the next few weeks, Elijah spent afternoons at Marcus's community center. The space buzzed with energy as children worked on homework, created art projects, and shared stories. George noticed the change in Elijah almost immediately. The way he held his head higher, how his smile came more easily. "Your son has a natural talent for leadership," Marcus told George one afternoon. "He's been helping younger kids with their art projects. They look up to him." George watched through the doorway as Elijah sat at a table with other children, showing them how to mix colors for their paintings. His son's face glowed with confidence as he explained his technique to his eager audience. That evening, Elijah bounded through their front door, clutching a handful of drawings. "Dad, look what we made today." His eyes shone with excitement as he spread the artwork across the kitchen table. "Marcus taught us about African patterns, and we made our own designs." George felt his heart swell as he watched Elijah chatter about his day, his son's happiness filling their home with new energy. George's hands trembled slightly as he held his phone, listening to Mrs. Blake's excited voice about Elijah's award-winning project on racial injustice. His pride swelled, but then came the unexpected news. "Mr. Wilkins," Mrs. Blake said carefully, "there's something else. Elijah's biological aunt, Andrea, has reached out to the school. She'd like to meet with you." George's throat tightened. He hadn't expected this. After arranging the meeting, he spent days wondering what to say. The coffee shop was quiet when they arrived. Andrea sat at a corner table, her expression guarded but polite. She stood to greet them, her eyes fixed on Elijah. "Hello, Elijah," she said softly, then turned to George with a more measured look. "Mr. Wilkins." They settled into their seats, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. Andrea ordered a coffee while George got Elijah a hot chocolate. "I'll be direct," Andrea said, stirring her coffee. "I need to understand why a white man would choose to adopt a black child. Do you truly understand what Elijah needs? His culture, his identity?" George felt his chest tighten, but kept his voice steady. "I love Elijah with all my heart. I've been learning about his heritage, connecting him with mentors who share his background. I know I can't understand everything, but I'm committed to helping him understand who he is." Andrea's expression softened slightly, but her doubt remained clear. "He should have been with family," she insisted, "someone who understands his experience firsthand." As they prepared to leave, Andrea's stance had softened somewhat. We'll stay in touch," she said, though uncertainty lingered in her voice. On the drive home, Elijah's small voice broke the silence. "Dad, is everything okay?" George met his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "We're just trying to figure some things out, buddy." But he couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes, and he saw that Elijah noticed it too. The weight of Andrea's words haunted George in the weeks that followed their coffee shop meeting. Every text message they exchanged left him wondering if he was doing enough for Elijah. Still, watching his son grow more confident under Marcus's guidance brought him joy. Elijah's smile seemed brighter these days, his shoulders straighter. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, Elijah leaned against George's shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "I used to feel different all the time. But now, I know who I am. I belong here with you, and I also belong with people who look like me." George's heart swelled at his son's words, but before he could respond, an unexpected visitor arrived. Andrea stood at the bottom of the porch steps, her expression unreadable. "I hope I'm not interrupting dinner," she said, climbing the steps. "But I need to ask you something, George." They settled in the living room, where the family photos lined the walls. Andrea's eyes scanned them before turning back to George. "Have you ever really understood our struggle?" she asked directly. "Were you ever involved in the civil rights movement?" George sat up straighter, his eyes distant with memory. "I was there," he said quietly. "In Birmingham, 1963. I saw the fire hoses, the police dogs." His voice cracked. "I grew up in a segregated town, watched my black neighbors fight for basic dignity. I couldn't stay silent then, and I won't stay silent now." Andrea's expression transformed, surprise replacing skepticism. You were there?" she whispered. "The same fight continues today," George added. "That's why I'm working so hard to help Elijah understand both his heritage and his worth." Andrea's eyes welled with tears. "I was wrong about you, George," she admitted. "I thought you couldn't possibly understand. But you've been fighting this fight longer than I've been alive." The evening sun cast long shadows through the dining room window as George watched Elijah push his spaghetti around his plate. Usually, dinner was their time to share stories about their day. But lately, the silence had grown thick between them. "How was the community center today?" George asked, trying to catch his son's eye. "Fine," Elijah mumbled, not looking up from his plate. George's heart ached at the distance he felt growing between them. He remembered the days when Elijah would bounce into the kitchen, eager to tell him about everything that happened. Now, getting more than one-word answers felt like pulling teeth. The next morning, George's phone rang while he was making breakfast. It was Marcus. "George, I wanted to talk to you about Elijah," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "He's been spending more time with the other kids here, which is great, but something seems off." George gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "Some of the kids here, they've been saying he acts too white," Marcus explained. "And from what I understand, he's getting the opposite at school. He's caught between two worlds, George, and it's wearing on him." Marcus suggested setting up regular conversations about identity and self-acceptance. He needs to know it's okay to be exactly who he is. That evening, George found Elijah in the living room, curled up on the couch. "Can we talk, buddy?" George asked, sitting beside him. Elijah shrugged, but George noticed his shoulders tense. "What's been on your mind lately?" George pressed gently. "You've been so quiet." Elijah's lower lip trembled. "I don't fit anywhere, Dad," he whispered. "At school, I'm different from everyone else. At the center—" He paused, swallowing hard. "They say I'm not black enough. Where do I belong?" The museum's grand entrance loomed before them as George guided Elijah up the stone steps. Inside, their footsteps echoed through the quiet halls as they made their way to the Civil Rights exhibition. George watched Elijah carefully, hoping to see some spark of interest in his son's downcast eyes. They stopped at a black and white photograph of protesters marching with signs. Elijah leaned closer, studying their determined faces. "Those people were so brave," George said softly. "They knew what they were doing was dangerous, but they did it anyway." Elijah nodded, but remained silent as they moved through the exhibition. They passed displays about segregated schools, lunch counter sit-ins, and the Freedom Riders. George's heart tightened as memories of his own youth came flooding back. Standing before a large portrait of Martin Luther King Jr., Elijah finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why does it always seem like it's so hard for people like me?" George knelt beside his son, meeting his eyes. "You know, I was there during some of this history. I marched in protest when I was young. I saw how hard people fought for change." "You did?" Elijah's eyes widened. "I did. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder with people who believed that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." George's voice grew thick with emotion. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we believed it was worth fighting for." Elijah stared at the portrait, then back at his father. For the first time in weeks, George saw real curiosity in his son's eyes. As they walked toward the exit, Elijah was quieter than usual, but it was different from his recent withdrawn silence. This was a thoughtful quiet. He turned to George and said, "Dad, tell me more about when you were in the protests." George and Elijah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by colorful construction paper and markers. Elijah was working on a school project about family heritage when a firm knock echoed through the house. George opened the door to find Andrea standing there, her expression serious. "George, can we talk?" He invited her in, noticing how she glanced worriedly at Elijah before turning back to him. "I've heard from some parents at school that Elijah's been really quiet lately," she said softly. They moved to the living room while Elijah continued his project in the kitchen. Andrea sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I owe you an apology first," she began, her voice gentle. "I was wrong to judge you so harshly before. I can see how much you care about Elijah." George nodded, surprised by her change in tone. "Thank you, Andrea. That means a lot. But I'm still worried about him," she continued. I think maybe he needs more connection to his roots." She leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "He has cousins, George. Children his age who could help him understand who he is, where he comes from." "What are you suggesting?" George asked, though he already knew. "Let him spend some time with us, with his biological family. My kids would love to get to know their cousin." She smiled hopefully. "It might help him feel more complete." George sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The idea made sense, but it also filled him with uncertainty. Would it help Elijah find his place, or would it only confuse him more? As Andrea left that evening, George stood in the doorway, watching her walk to her car. The weight of her suggestion pressed heavily on his shoulders. Later that night, he sat by the window, staring out at the darkness, trying to figure out what would be best for his son. That Saturday morning, Elijah stood in the hallway with his overnight bag shifting from foot to foot. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice uncertain, I think I want to visit Aunt Andrea and my cousins." George knelt down to meet his son's eyes. "What's on your mind, buddy?" "I feel weird," Elijah admitted, his fingers playing with the straps of his bag. "Like I'm being pulled two different ways. Like if I go there, I'm leaving you behind." George's heart ached at his son's words. He placed his hands gently on Elijah's shoulders. "Listen to me, Elijah. You don't have to choose between us. Your life is big enough for both families. It's okay to want to know them, to learn about that part of who you are. You won't be mad?" "Never," George said firmly. "I'll always support you." The weekend passed slowly for George. He checked his phone often, fighting the urge to call Andrea. When Sunday evening arrived, he heard her car pull up in the driveway. Elijah walked in quietly, his expression thoughtful. After Andrea left, George noticed Elijah sitting on the couch, lost in thought. "How was it?" he asked, sitting beside him. "It was different," Elijah said slowly. "My cousins are nice. We played games and talked about school." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But Dad, I missed being home. With you." "Yeah?" George's voice was soft. "Yeah. I learned stuff about my family, and that's good. But..." Elijah leaned against George's shoulder. "This is where I belong. With you." They sat together on the couch, the evening light casting long shadows across the living room. George wrapped an arm around his son, feeling the truth of Elijah's words settle between them like a warm blanket. "You're part of both worlds, Elijah," George said. "And that makes you special. Not divided, whole." Elijah nodded, a small smile finally breaking across his face. "I know that now, Dad. I really do." The community center buzzed with excitement as people filed in for the diversity celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the smell of various cultural dishes filled the air. George adjusted his tie nervously while Elijah beamed beside him, wearing his favorite blue button-down shirt. "You okay, Dad?" Elijah asked, noticing George's fidgeting hands. "Just a little nervous about speaking," George admitted with a gentle smile. When it was George's turn to take the stage, Elijah squeezed his hand for support. George cleared his throat and looked out at the diverse crowd before him. "When I first adopted Elijah," George began, his voice steady and warm, "I thought love would be enough. But I learned that raising a black child as a white father meant I needed to do more than just love. I needed to understand, to learn, and to grow." Elijah watched his father speak, his chest swelling with pride as George shared their journey. He remembered the difficult days at school, the confusion about his identity, and how they'd worked through it together. "My son taught me more about courage than I ever knew," George continued, glancing at Elijah. "He showed me that family isn't about looking the same or sharing the same background. It's about standing together, supporting each other, and celebrating our differences." The audience nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. Elijah felt a warmth spread through his chest as he realized how far they'd come together. After the applause died down, they walked home under the evening sky, their footsteps in sync. Elijah's hand found George's, and he squeezed it tight. "You were right, Dad," Elijah said softly. "I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of us." George smiled, his eyes glistening with joy as they continued their walk home, their bond stronger than ever before. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as George and Elijah walked along the winding path. Elijah's hands moved animatedly as he talked about his upcoming presentation. "Did you know that Rosa Parks wasn't the first person to refuse to give up her seat?" Elijah asked, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "There was also Claudette Colvin." George smiled, watching his son's confident demeanor. Gone was the hesitant boy who used to shrink from discussions about race. In his place stood a young man eager to share his knowledge. "You've really done your research," George said proudly. "Marcus helped me find some great books about it," Elijah replied. "And Andrea told me stories about our family's involvement in the movement, too." Later that evening, Elijah set up his presentation materials on the kitchen table. He'd created a timeline with photos and important dates, each carefully labeled in his neat handwriting. "This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington," Elijah explained, pointing to a black and white photograph. "And here's John Lewis crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge." George watched, his heart full, as Elijah moved confidently through each section of his presentation. The boy who once struggled to find his place now spoke with authority about both historical figures and modern-day activists. "And this part," Elijah said, gesturing to a section about local civil rights history, Reminds me of your stories, Dad, about the protests you joined. George felt his eyes grow misty. Seeing Elijah embrace both sides of his heritage, the history of the civil rights movement and their personal family story, filled him with joy. As Elijah finished his presentation, he looked up at George with a smile. "Can I invite some friends over when I'm done presenting at school? Maybe Marcus and some kids from the community center, and my friends from class too?" "Of course," George replied warmly. They sat down at the table for dinner, the presentation material still spread out before them, both feeling content in the quiet moment they shared. The phone rang early Monday morning as George was preparing breakfast. When he answered, Mrs. McAllister's warm voice greeted him. "Mr. Wilkins, I have wonderful news," she said. "Elijah's project on civil rights has been selected for our annual Excellence in Education Award." George's hand gripped the phone tighter. That's amazing." "We'd love to have you both at the ceremony this Friday," Mrs. McAllister continued. Elijah's work really stood out. His personal connection to the material and thorough research impressed everyone. After hanging up, George found Elijah at the kitchen table, already dressed for school. "Son, I just got some exciting news," George said, his voice full of emotion. "Your project won an award." Elijah looked up from his cereal, his eyes widening. "Really? But it's just a project." George could see the hint of a smile tugging at his son's lips, betraying his modest words. At the ceremony that Friday, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. When Mrs. McAllister called Elijah's name, George watched his son walk confidently to the stage. Elijah accepted the award with grace, then turned to the microphone. "I want to thank my dad," Elijah said, his voice clear and strong. "He helped me understand that learning about our history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about understanding who we are and where we come from. He encouraged me to dig deeper and be proud of my heritage." The audience broke into applause, and George felt tears welling up in his eyes. As Elijah made his way back to his seat, George could see the transformation in his son, the proud set of his shoulders, the confident smile, the way he carried himself with such self-assurance. After the ceremony, they walked out of the auditorium together, hand in hand. Elijah clutched his award, beaming with pride. "Thanks again, Dad," Elijah said softly. George squeezed his son's hand, too moved for words. The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. George recognized Andrea's number on the caller ID. "George, I wanted to talk to you about something," Andrea said warmly. "We're planning a family reunion this weekend, and I'd love for you and Elijah to come." George's stomach tightened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "That sounds wonderful. Let me check with Elijah." When he told Elijah about the invitation, his son's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we go, Dad? Please." George nodded, pushing aside his own apprehension. "Of course we can." Saturday arrived bright and sunny. The reunion was held in a local park with tables laden with food and music playing in the background. As soon as they arrived, Elijah's cousins rushed over to greet him, pulling him into their group. George stood back, watching as Elijah laughed and played with his cousins. They shared the same warm brown eyes, the same infectious laugh. His son fit in so naturally with them, it made his heart ache a little. Andrea approached quietly, holding 2 cups of lemonade. She handed one to George. "You know," she said softly, "the way he looks at you when you're not watching. That's pure love, George. This reunion doesn't change that. It just adds to who he is." George sipped his lemonade, letting her words sink in. He watched as Elijah showed his cousins his award from school, his face beaming with pride. As the day drew to a close, Elijah ran up to George and wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. "Thanks for bringing me, Dad. This was amazing." George hugged him back, feeling the strength of their bond. Elijah might have two families, but their connection was unshakable. "Can we visit my cousins again sometime?" Elijah asked as they gathered their things. "Of course we can, son," George replied, his earlier doubts melting away. George pulled into the parking lot of their favorite coffee shop, needing a break from the long drive home. The warm afternoon sun streamed through the windows as they waited in line. Behind them, two men spoke in hushed but angry tones about a recent incident in town. "Can you believe they stopped him just because of how he looked?" one man said. "Classic racial profiling, if you ask me." George tensed, glancing down at Elijah, who was listening intently. "Dad," Elijah whispered, tugging at George's sleeve, "what's racial profiling?" George's throat tightened. He led Elijah to a quiet corner table, their drinks forgotten. How could he explain such an ugly truth to his son while preserving his sense of safety? "Well, son," George began carefully, "sometimes people make unfair judgments about others based on the color of their skin. They might treat them differently or suspect them of doing something wrong just because of how they look." Elijah's brow furrowed. "But that's not right." "No, it's not," George agreed. "It happens because some people let fear and misunderstanding control their actions instead of getting to know others as individuals." "Why do people treat others like that?" Elijah asked, his voice small. George reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "Often, people are afraid of what they don't understand. But that's why it's so important for people like you and me to help make changes. We can show others that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and kindness." Later that evening, as they unpacked their bags at home, Elijah turned to George with determination in his eyes. "Dad, can we go to the community center? I want to help with their equality program." George smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course we can, son." The community center buzzed with activity as George and Elijah helped set up tables for the fundraising event. Colorful banners promoting equality and justice hung from the walls, and volunteers bustled about, organizing donation boxes and information packets. Elijah worked alongside other kids his age, arranging chairs and sorting pamphlets. George noticed how naturally his son fit in with the group, laughing and chatting as they worked. There was an ease to Elijah's movements, a confidence that hadn't been there before. "Elijah," Marcus called from across the room, "would you mind sharing a few words with everyone about why you're here today?" Elijah's eyes widened, but he nodded. George gave him an encouraging smile as he made his way to the front of the room. The crowd fell silent as Elijah took the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm here because I believe we can make things better if we work together. Sometimes people treat others unfairly because of how they look, but that's not right. My dad taught me that everyone deserves respect and kindness no matter what." Elijah paused, looking directly at George. "When we stand up for what's right and help each other, we can change things. That's why this matters to me." The room erupted in applause. George felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched his son beam with pride. After the event, they sat together on a bench outside the community center. "Dad," Elijah said softly, "I'm really proud to be your son." George pulled Elijah close, his heart full of love and pride. They walked home together, hand in hand, their footsteps in perfect sync. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as George and Elijah sat at the breakfast table, examining an invitation that had arrived in the mail. It was for a community gathering aimed at bringing different cultural groups together for meaningful dialogue. "Your teacher thinks it would be good for you," George said gently, watching Elijah's expression. "But it's up to you, buddy." Elijah fidgeted with his cereal spoon. "Will there be other kids there?" "I'm sure there will be," George replied, "and it might be a chance to learn some new things." At the community center that afternoon, the room hummed with conversation. People from various backgrounds mingled, sharing stories and experiences. Elijah stayed close to George at first, but his eyes were wide with curiosity. A woman with a warm smile approached them. "I'm Angela," she said, extending her hand. "I help organize events like this." Elijah shook her hand shyly. Angela knelt down to his level. "You know, it's not always easy being different from others," she said kindly. "But that's what makes you special." George watched as Angela spoke to Elijah about identity and belonging. Her words were passionate but gentle, and Elijah hung on everyone. Though George felt slightly intimidated by her strong presence, he admired how she connected with his son. Throughout the afternoon, they moved from group to group, each conversation opening new perspectives. A local pastor shared stories about his experiences during the civil rights movement. A young activist discussed modern-day challenges. George and Elijah listened intently, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. As they prepared to leave, Elijah turned to George. "Thanks for bringing me, Dad," he said softly. "I learned a lot today." George squeezed his son's shoulder, grateful for the community that had welcomed them so warmly and the new understanding they'd both gained. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as George and Elijah trudged up the front steps, arms laden with grocery bags. They had just finished a long day of running errands, and both were looking forward to relaxing at home. The sudden ring of the doorbell made them jump. George wasn't expecting anyone, and these days they rarely got unexpected visitors. He opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked nervous, but determined. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Tanya, Elijah's mother." George felt his heart skip a beat. Beside him, Elijah went completely still. George took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Would you like to come in?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. In the living room, Tanya perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting between George and Elijah. "I know this is unexpected," she began. "I've been through some really hard times, but I've turned things around. I got help, went back to school." She paused, her voice trembling. "I never stopped thinking about you, Elijah." Elijah sat close to George, his shoulder pressed against his father's arm. His face showed a mix of emotions, confusion, curiosity, and uncertainty. "I understand if this is too much," Tanya continued, "but I'd really like to get to know you if you're willing." George watched as Elijah struggled with the situation. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, letting him know he was there for support. After several moments of tense silence, Elijah spoke quietly. I'd like to know more about you." He glanced up at George, adding quickly, "But Dad will always be my dad." George smiled softly, his heart full of love, as Tanya and Elijah began making tentative plans to meet again. He remained nearby, a steady presence, as his son took his first steps into this new chapter of their lives. George sat in his favorite armchair, trying to focus on reading, but finding his mind wandering constantly to Elijah. The house felt unusually quiet without his son's presence. He checked his phone again. No messages. He knew Elijah was safe with Tanya, but he couldn't help feeling anxious. As the sun began to set, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the porch. Elijah walked in, his expression thoughtful. George waited patiently, giving his son time to gather his thoughts. "Her apartment is nice," Elijah finally said, settling onto the couch. Small, but she has photos everywhere, even some of me as a baby. George nodded encouragingly, his heart aching a little at the mention of Elijah's baby photos. She told me about her struggles, Elijah continued, his voice quiet, about why she couldn't keep me. I understand better now, but... He paused, twisting his hands in his lap. It's weird, Dad. I feel bad for her, and part of me wants to know her more. But then I feel like I'm being disloyal to you. You're not being disloyal, George said softly. Getting to know Tanya doesn't change anything between us. Whatever you decide about having her in your life, I'll support you. My love for you isn't going anywhere. Tears welled up in Elijah's eyes. He got up from the couch and wrapped his arms around George in a tight hug. Thanks, Dad, he whispered. Thanks for always being there. George held his son close, feeling the familiar warmth of their bond. We're family, he said simply. That's never going to change. Elijah smiled through his tears, finding comfort in the security of George's love. George stood at the window, watching Elijah climb into Tanya's car. His heart felt heavy as they drove away. Over the past few weeks, these visits had become more frequent, and each time, George battled with a growing sense of uncertainty. At the community center later that day, George sat with Angela, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. I feel like I'm losing him, George admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time he goes to see her, I wonder if he'll come back seeing me differently. Angela leaned forward, her eyes full of understanding. George, you've been there for that boy through everything. You taught him to walk, to read, to be proud of who he is. That kind of bond doesn't just disappear. But what if, George started. No what ifs, Angela interrupted gently. You raised him. You gave him love, stability, and a voice. Trust in that. When Elijah returned that evening, he found George sitting in the kitchen. They shared a moment of silence before Elijah spoke. Dad, he said softly, I know this is hard. I feel torn sometimes trying to figure out how to balance everything. But you're my father. You always will be. Later that night, Elijah came to George's study. His eyes were wet with tears. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you weren't important, Elijah said. You're everything to me, Dad. Everything you've done for me. I wouldn't be who I am without you. George pulled his son into a tight embrace, feeling the tension of the past weeks melt away. They held each other, father and son, their bond stronger than ever. The aroma of roasted chicken filled George's kitchen as he, Elijah, and Tanya sat down for dinner. The awkwardness that had once hung between them like a heavy curtain was gone, replaced by an easy comfort that surprised them all. This is really good, George, Tanya said, taking another bite. I had no idea you could cook like this. George smiled, watching as Elijah passed the bowl of mashed potatoes to his birth mother. Susan, my late wife, taught me. She always said a father should know his way around a kitchen. Dad makes the best Sunday dinners, Elijah added proudly, looking between his parents with contentment in his eyes. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally to deeper topics. Tanya set down her fork and looked at George with genuine emotion in her eyes. I want you to know how grateful I am, she said softly. The way you've raised him, the love you've given him. I couldn't have hoped for better. George nodded, touched by her words. And I'm grateful you're here now, Tanya. Elijah deserves to know both sides of his story. Elijah beamed, soaking in the warmth of their exchange. The conversation shifted to the upcoming community celebration, where they would all participate together in support of racial justice and inclusion. I think it's amazing we're all going, Elijah said. Most of my friends can't believe how well we all get along now. Well, "We're family," George replied simply. "Different pieces of the same puzzle, but we fit together just right." They continued their meal, planning their participation in the celebration, their voices mixing with laughter and shared purpose. As Tanya helped clear the plates, she and George exchanged knowing looks. They had created something beautiful here, something that transcended traditional family boundaries. The evening concluded with all three of them walking into the community center together, their steps aligned, their hearts united in their love for Elijah and their commitment to making the world a better place. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front porch as George sipped his coffee, watching Elijah's animated face. His son had just returned from a week-long leadership camp for Black youth, and his enthusiasm was contagious. "Dad, you should have seen it." Elijah's eyes sparkled as he described his experiences. "We learned about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., but also about lesser-known heroes like Bayard Rustin and Fannie Lou Hamer." George nodded encouragingly, his heart swelling with pride. "Tell me more about the other kids you met." "There were so many amazing people there," Elijah continued, leaning forward in his chair. "Kids just like me, dealing with the same things I deal with. We talked about everything, our families, our dreams, our struggles. It felt like coming home in a way I can't really explain." As the days passed, George noticed subtle changes in his son. Elijah walked taller, spoke more confidently, and seemed more comfortable in his own skin. During dinner one evening, Elijah surprised George by sharing his plans for the future. "I think I want to study social justice in college," Elijah announced, his voice steady and sure. "Maybe become a community organizer or work with youth. There's so much work still to be done, Dad." George watched as his son moved effortlessly between both worlds, proudly embracing his Black heritage while remaining deeply connected to his white family. The tension that had once existed seemed to have melted away, replaced by a beautiful harmony. That evening, they attended a community event at the Cultural Center. George stood back, watching Elijah work the room with easy confidence. His son moved smoothly between groups, chatting with Black and white peers alike, completely at ease with who he was. The shy, uncertain boy who had once struggled with his identity had blossomed into a young man who knew exactly where he belonged. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as George walked into the small cafe where Andrea was waiting. She sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Her smile was warmer than it had been during their first meeting, and George felt some of his nervousness fade away. "Thank you for meeting me," Andrea said as George settled into his chair. "I've been following Elijah's progress, especially after hearing about his success at the leadership camp." George nodded, his face lighting up at the mention of his son. "He's really come into his own these past few months. The change in him is remarkable. His confidence, his sense of self. He's not afraid to speak up anymore." Andrea listened intently, her eyes softening. "I can tell how proud you are of him, George, and you should be." As they talked, Andrea's expression grew more thoughtful. She set her coffee cup down and looked directly at George. "You know, I've been thinking about our early conversations, about all my concerns regarding Elijah's upbringing." George held his breath, waiting. "I've seen how much Elijah's grown, George," Andrea admitted, her voice gentle. "I can see the love you have for him, and I think that's what matters most." Relief washed over George as they continued their conversation, discussing the importance of maintaining Elijah's connection to his Black heritage while nurturing the loving family environment George had created. "Thank you," Andrea said softly, "for being so open to learning and growing, for making sure Elijah knows both sides of who he is." As their meeting drew to a close, Andrea stood and wrapped George in a warm hug. "I'm proud of the man Elijah is becoming," she whispered. "He's in good hands." George headed home, feeling lighter than he had in months. The tension that had existed between him and Andrea had finally dissolved, replaced by mutual understanding and respect. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as families filled the bleachers. George sat between Tanya and Andrea, all of them craning their necks to spot Elijah among the sea of black caps and gowns. When George finally caught sight of his son standing proudly at the front with his classmates, his heart swelled with emotion. Elijah looked different in his graduation attire, taller, more mature. George's mind drifted back to their first meeting at the adoption agency, to the tiny baby who had grabbed his finger with such trust. Now that same boy stood on the cusp of adulthood, ready to take on the world. When Elijah's name was called, George leapt to his feet, clapping until his hands hurt. Elijah's face broke into a wide smile as he crossed the stage, accepting his diploma with confidence. The crowd's cheers echoed through the gymnasium, but George barely heard them through the rush of pride in his ears. After the ceremony, George found a quiet corner away from the celebrating crowds. Elijah approached him, diploma clutched in his hand. "Dad," Elijah began, his voice thick with emotion, "I wouldn't be here without you. Everything you've done for me, all the support you've given me. I can't thank you enough." George pulled Elijah into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, son. So proud of the man you've become." They talked about Elijah's plans to attend the local college in the fall, where he would study social justice. His eyes lit up as he described his dreams of making a difference in the world, of fighting for equality and understanding. As the celebrations began to wind down, George and Elijah walked arm in arm toward their car. The weight of Elijah's arm against his filled George with an overwhelming sense of love and pride. His son, his beautiful, strong, compassionate son, was ready to begin his next chapter. George sat in his living room, surrounded by photo albums spread across the coffee table. Sunlight streamed through the windows as he traced his finger over a picture of Elijah's first steps. Another showed them at the community center, both wearing matching volunteer shirts. Each photo told a story of their journey together. His heart felt heavy yet full as he heard Elijah's footsteps coming down the stairs. The sound of wheels rolling across hardwood made George look up. Elijah stood in the doorway, his suitcase packed and ready. "Dad, I'm ready to go," Elijah said softly, a smile lighting up his face. His eyes sparkled with excitement for the adventure ahead. George stood up, crossing the room in a few steps. He wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close. "I love you so much, Elijah. I'm so proud of everything you've become." Elijah hugged him back tightly. "I love you too, Dad." As they embraced, George thought about their journey, from those first uncertain days of adoption to now, watching his son prepare to start college. Through every challenge, every triumph, they had grown stronger together. Elijah had found his voice, his identity, his place in the world, and George had discovered depths of love he never knew existed. They pulled apart, both wiping away tears. Elijah picked up his suitcase, heading for the door. George followed him out to the driveway, where Elijah's car was packed with everything he needed for his dorm room. Standing on the front porch, George watched as Elijah drove away toward his new life at college. A profound sense of contentment settled over him. Their story together had shaped them both in ways he never could have imagined, and the love they shared would always be their guide. If you enjoyed the story of George, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.